The cold November rain lashed against the windows of our suburban Seattle home as I, Anna, a 32-year-old high school teacher, stood trembling in the hallway. I had just returned from the hospital after visiting my dying mother, only to find my suitcases already sitting by the front door. My mother-in-law, Margaret, stood at the top of the stairs, her arms folded tightly across her designer silk blouse, looking down at me like I was a stray dog she had finally decided to kick out. "You used the emergency fund," Margaret said, her voice dropping like a heavy stone. $20,000, Anna. Without asking for my permission, I wiped the rainwater from my face, my breath hitching in my chest. "It wasn't an emergency fund for your vacations, Margaret. It was my salary. I earned that money to pay for my mother's heart surgery. She would have died without it." Margaret didn't blink. She walked down the stairs, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, framed photograph. It was the only picture I had of my mother before she got sick. Before I could react, Margaret opened the front door and tossed the frame into the dark, muddy yard. "This house doesn't belong to you anymore," Margaret declared, her eyes cold and empty. "I have already talked to my son. David agrees with me. You are a thief who steals from your own family to support a sinking ship." I felt the blood drain from my face as I looked past her, hoping to see David, my husband of 7 years. But the house was silent. Margaret stepped forward, pushing me toward the threshold. "The locks will be changed in 10 minutes. And don't bother checking your bank app. Your access has been revoked. You wanted to spend money? Now you can see how far your pride gets you in the street." I stumbled back into the freezing rain, my fingers clawing at the mud to find my mother's photo. The glass was shattered, the paper soaking wet. Behind me, the heavy oak door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty street. I was a teacher with a master's degree and a decade of service, yet I was standing in the mud with nothing but a broken picture and a dead cell phone. Margaret's face appeared behind the glass of the window for a split second, a smirk of pure satisfaction on her lips. She thought she had won. She thought she had stripped me of everything. But as the rain soaked through my thin coat, a different kind of cold began to settle in my heart. It wasn't sadness. It was the beginning of a very calculated rage. I looked at the dark windows of the house I had helped pay for, the house where I had cooked every meal and cleaned every floor for 7 years. David hadn't even come to the door to say goodbye. He had let his mother throw me out like trash. I stood up, clutching the ruined photo to my chest, and started walking toward the main road. The bus stop was 3 miles away, and my pockets were empty. But for the first time in years, the suffocating shadow of Margaret was no longer over me. They wanted to see what happens when I have nothing? I would show them. I would show them exactly what a woman with nothing left to lose is capable of doing. The 3-mile walk to the nearest bus station felt like a journey through an icy purgatory. My wet clothes weighed 50 pounds, and every step in my waterlogged shoes reminded me of the life I had just lost. I reached the station only to realize I didn't even have a nickel for the fare. My phone was dead, a black mirror reflecting my pale, defeated face. I sat on the cold metal bench, clutching the ruined photo of my mother, while the late-night commuters looked away, avoiding the gaze of the shivering woman who looked like she had lost her mind. I kept waiting for a car to pull up. I kept waiting for David to realize that throwing his wife out into a storm was a crime against humanity. But as the minutes turned into an hour, the reality set in. David wasn't coming. He had spent his entire life under Margaret's thumb, and tonight, he had finally let her crush me to protect his own comfort. I looked at the wedding ring on my finger, a band of white gold that felt like a burning shackle. It was the only thing of value I had left. I stood up and started walking again, this time toward the 24-hour pawn shop near the city limits. The neon sign of the shop flickered, casting a sickly green light over the sidewalk. "How much for this?" I asked the man behind the glass, my voice raspy and thin. I slid the ring onto the velvet tray. The man barely looked up from his magazine. $200. "And that is being generous, lady." "It cost $5,000, I whispered, my heart breaking all over again. "The value just dropped," he said, staring at my wet hair and trembling hands. "Take it or leave it. I have got paperwork to do." I took the $200. It was a humiliating pittance, a fraction of what I had invested into my marriage, but it bought me a cheap motel room and a charger for my phone. As soon as the screen flickered to life, the notifications began to scream. Not from David. From the bank. Your joint account has been closed. Your credit card ending in 4211 has been reported stolen by the primary account holder. Margaret wasn't just kicking me out, she was branding me a criminal. She was making sure I couldn't even buy a sandwich without looking over my shoulder. I sat on the edge of the stained motel bed, watching the rain continue to pour outside. My mother was still in the hospital, recovering from the surgery I had paid for with my own sweat. If Margaret found out which hospital she was in, she would probably try to get her evicted from there, too. I realized then that playing fair was no longer an option. I opened my email and searched for a folder I had hidden years ago, a collection of documents I had found while doing the taxes for the family business. Margaret thought she was a genius of finance, but she was sloppy. She had been moving money through a shell company to avoid taxes on her real estate holdings for years. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the send button to an old contact I had in the local news. This was the nuclear option. If I did this, there would be no going back. David would lose his inheritance, and the family name would be dragged through the mud. But then I looked at my mother's ruined photo on the nightstand, and the hesitation vanished. You called me a thief, Margaret, I whispered to the empty room. Now let us see what the IRS calls you. Just as I was about to hit send, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered, expecting a telemarketer or perhaps a collector. Instead, it was a voice that made my skin crawl. It was Margaret's personal assistant, a woman who had always treated me like a servant. Anna? Margaret wanted me to remind you that your name is still on the lease for the teacher's apartment she helped you get 3 years ago. She has decided to terminate the contract. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the premises, or the police will be called for trespassing. The cliff was getting steeper. They weren't just taking the house, they were taking my career and my reputation. I didn't send the email to the news. Not yet. I had a better idea. A much more painful one. The morning light in the motel room was gray and unforgiving, highlighting the water stains on the ceiling that looked like bruises. I had exactly 5 hours before Margaret's threat to call the police at my apartment became a reality. I didn't go back to the apartment to pack. Instead, I put on my damp teaching blazer, brushed my hair until my scalp stung and walked straight into the Lion's Den, the elite private academy where I taught English and where Margaret sat on the board of directors. As I walked through the iron gates, I could feel the eyes of the other teachers on me. The news of my theft and the marital split had clearly traveled faster than the morning bus. I went straight to the office of Principal Sterling, a man who had laughed at all of Margaret's jokes for a decade. Anna, he said, not looking up from his desk. I was just about to call you. Given the legal complications mentioned by Mrs. Henderson this morning, we feel it is best if you take an immediate, unpaid leave of absence. We cannot have a teacher under investigation for financial fraud in front of our students. I didn't sit down. I stood in front of his mahogany desk, my hands flat on the surface. Investigation? Has a police report been filed, Principal Sterling? Or are you taking the word of a woman who is currently being audited by the Internal Revenue Service? Sterling froze. The silence in the room became heavy. Audited? What are you talking about? Margaret Henderson has been using this school's charitable foundation to funnel money into her private real estate holdings for 3 years, I lied with a face of stone. I didn't have proof of the school's involvement yet, but I knew Margaret's greed. I knew if she was stealing from the government, she was stealing from the school too. I have the ledger entries. I was going to bring them to the board, but since you are letting me go based on a phone call, perhaps the local news would be more interested. I saw the beads of sweat break out on his forehead. This was the power shift. For 7 years, I had been the quiet daughter-in-law who served tea. They forgot that I was a teacher who spent my days managing rooms full of teenagers. I knew how to spot a bully, and I knew how to break one. Now, I continued, my voice calm and low. I am going to my apartment to pack my belongings. I want 2 security guards to accompany me, not to watch me, but to ensure that Margaret Henderson does not set foot on the property while I am there. And you are going to sign a letter stating that my employment is in good standing and my leave is fully paid for the next 3 months. I can't just Sterling started, but I cut him off. You can. Or you can explain to the parents of this academy why their tuition money is being used to pay for Margaret's new beach house in Florida. You have 10 minutes. I walked out of his office and sat in the faculty lounge. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought I might faint, but my face remained a mask of ice. I checked my phone. One message from David. Anna, please stop this. My mother is furious. Just apologize and return the money you took for your mom's hospital bill. She might let you come home if you show some remorse. Remorse. The word felt like a slap. I didn't reply. Instead, I blocked his number. David wasn't a husband, he was a hostage, and I no longer had the energy to negotiate for his soul. 10 minutes later, Sterling walked out with a signed envelope and 2 confused security guards. You have until sunset, Anna. After that, I can't help you. I don't need your help, Principal Sterling, I said, taking the envelope. I need you to stay out of my way. As I rode in the back of the security SUV toward the apartment Margaret thought she could take from me, I opened the ledger files on my phone. I didn't just have evidence of tax evasion. I had found the one thing that would truly destroy David. The proof that Margaret had been paying his business expenses for years because his own consulting firm was a bankrupt shell. My husband wasn't a success. He was a paid actor in his mother's play. And tonight, I was going to pull the curtain down. The security SUV pulled up to the curb of my apartment complex just as a silver Mercedes drifted into the spot marked for guests. I didn't need to see the license plate to know who it was. Margaret climbed out of the car, looking perfectly poised in a navy wool coat, her eyes scanning the building like she was an empress inspecting a conquered territory. When she saw the 2 uniformed guards stepping out behind me, her composure flickered for a fraction of a second. What is the meaning of this, Anna? She asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I told you to vacate. I didn't tell you to bring a private army to my property. I didn't answer her. I gestured for the guards to follow me to the elevator. I am here to collect my life, Margaret. And since you have already proven that you enjoy destroying things that don't belong to you, I brought witnesses. We reached the 4th floor in silence. The air in the hallway felt thin, charged with a static tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. Inside the apartment, the silence was even worse. It was the home I had decorated with my own modest salary, every candle and cushion chosen to create a sanctuary. Now, it just felt like a crime scene. You have 2 hours, Margaret said, leaning against the kitchen island. After that, I am changing the codes. David is already moving his things back into the main house. He realized that a wife who steals is a liability he cannot afford. I started pulling my suitcases from the closet, my movements steady and deliberate. David didn't realize anything, Margaret. David hasn't had an original thought since he was 5 years old. He does what you tell him because he is terrified you will stop paying the lease on his fake office downtown. Margaret laughed, a cold, dry sound. You are delusional. My son is a successful consultant. He doesn't need a dime from me. I stopped packing and walked over to the kitchen island. I pulled my phone from my pocket and laid it on the marble surface between us. I opened the file marked confidential expenses and slid the screen toward her. Is that so? I asked. Then why did you wire $40,000 to his business account last Tuesday? And why does the memo say payroll assistance? It seems your successful son hasn't turned a profit in 3 years. You aren't raising a man, Margaret. You are funding a ghost. The color drained from Margaret's face. She stared at the screen, her mouth tightening into a thin line. For the first time, I saw a flash of genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't fear of me. It was fear of the truth being exposed. Where did you get this? She hissed, her voice dropping to a whisper. I am a teacher, remember? I am very good at research, I said, leaning in closer. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I know about the shell company in Delaware. I know about the foundation funds. If you so much as whisper a bad word about my mother or my career to anyone else in this city, I won't just go to the police. I will go to the board of the academy and show them exactly how you have been laundering money through the school's scholarship fund. You wouldn't, she breathed. You would lose your job too. You signed those tax returns as his spouse. I have a signed letter from Principal Sterling granting me a 3-month paid leave, I said, holding up the envelope. And as for the tax returns, I have a very good lawyer who specializes in innocent spouse relief. I'll be fine. You, on the other hand, will be wearing a very different kind of designer suit, one with orange stripes. Margaret reached for the phone, but I snatched it away. The power shift was complete. She was no longer the Empress. She was a woman caught in a trap of her own making. "Get out," I said, my voice as cold as the rain from the night before. "I have packing to do, and if I see your car in this parking lot when I leave, the first email goes to the Internal Revenue Service." She didn't say another word. She grabbed her handbag and marched out of the apartment, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm against the floor. I stood in the middle of my living room, my chest heaving, the adrenaline finally starting to fade. I had won the battle, but the war was far from over. I looked at the empty hallway and then at my suitcases. I had 3 months of salary, enough evidence to burn a legacy to the ground, and a mother who needed me. For the first time since the door slammed in my face last night, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a storm. I spent the next 48 hours in a small, sterile hospital room, watching the steady rhythm of the heart monitor that kept my mother alive. The surgery had been a success, but her recovery was fragile. I had used the last of the cash from the pawned ring to buy a comfortable chair for the corner of the room, refusing to leave her side. I knew Margaret. A woman like her didn't retreat, she simply changed her angle of attack. The blow came at 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. A man in a cheap polyester suit entered the room without knocking. He didn't look like a doctor. He looked like a process server. "Anna Henderson," he asked, holding out a thick manila envelope. "You have been served. Temporary restraining order filed by David Henderson and Margaret Henderson. You are prohibited from contacting them or coming within 500 feet of their primary residence or place of business." I took the papers, my heart going cold. A restraining order? On what grounds? "Harassment and attempted extortion," the man said, already turning to leave. "And there is a memo from the hospital administration attached. Your mother's secondary insurance provider, which is linked to the Henderson Family Trust, has just flagged her account for a fraud review. All payments are suspended effective immediately." I felt the air leave my lungs. Margaret was trying to kill my mother by pulling her funding in the middle of a critical recovery. It was a move of pure, calculated evil. I looked at the manila envelope and then at my mother's pale, sleeping face. The rage that had been simmering in my chest turned into something sharp and surgical. "Tell Margaret I got the message," I whispered, though the man was already gone. I didn't panic. I didn't call David to beg. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and contacted the one person Margaret feared more than the IRS, her own sister, Evelyn. Evelyn had been exiled from the family 20 years ago for marrying a man Margaret deemed beneath them. She had been cut off from the trust, and she had spent 2 decades watching from the sidelines as Margaret built her empire on lies. We met at a small diner 2 blocks from the hospital. Evelyn looked exactly like Margaret but with kinder eyes and hands that showed the work of a real life. "She is cutting off your mother's insurance?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling with indignation as she read the papers. "That is a new low, even for her. Margaret always thought she was the guardian of the family legacy. But she is just a parasite. I have the evidence of her shell companies, Evelyn," I said, leaning across the table, "but I need something more. I need the password to the legacy vault at the Henderson estate, the one where your father kept the original deeds before Margaret took over the board." Evelyn's eyes widened. "That vault hasn't been opened since 1995. If the original deeds are still there, they will prove that Margaret forged your father's signature to transfer the property rights to her own name. It would invalidate everything she owns. Give me the code, Evelyn. Help me finish this and I will make sure your branch of the family is restored in the final settlement." Evelyn hesitated for only a second before reaching into her purse and scribbling a series of numbers on a napkin. "The code is my birthday." The one thing she tried to make everyone forget. As I walked back to the hospital, my phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. I knew it was David. I finally unblocked him just to hear the sound of his defeat. "Anna, please," he sobbed into the phone. "My mother is going crazy. She is selling the house. She says we are moving to Europe. She is burning all the files in the backyard. Just come home and tell her you won't go to the news. I'll make sure your mom's bills are paid, I promise." "It is too late for promises, David," I said, watching the rain start to fall again against the hospital windows. "Tell your mother to keep the fire going. She is going to need it to stay warm when she has nothing left but the clothes on her back." I hung up. The insurance suspension was a bluff Margaret couldn't maintain once the hospital saw my new legal representation. I had 3 months of salary, a vengeful aunt, and a code that would unlock the secret history of a criminal empire. Margaret had thrown me out into the mud. Now, I was going to bury her in it. The smell of burning paper hung heavy over the Henderson estate, a bitter perfume that signaled Margaret's desperation. I sat in a rented sedan a block away, watching the flickering orange glow of a bonfire in the backyard through a pair of binoculars. David was right. She was burning the evidence. But she was burning the wrong things. She was destroying the branches while the roots remained buried in the basement. I waited until 2 o'clock in the morning, the hour when even the most paranoid minds succumb to exhaustion. I didn't use the front gate. I knew the perimeter from 7 years of living there, the one spot near the rose garden where the security camera had a blind spot because Margaret refused to trim the bushes. I slipped through the gap in the fence, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The restraining order meant that if I was caught, I wouldn't just be sued, I would be jailed. But the thought of my mother's hospital bill and the shattered glass of her photograph gave me a cold, steady courage. I entered the house through the basement laundry chute, a tight squeeze that left my blazer torn and my palms scraped. The air downstairs was cool and smelled of damp stone. I found the heavy steel door of the legacy vault tucked behind a row of vintage wine racks. It was a relic from 1920, a massive piece of engineering that required both a physical key and a code. I pulled the key from my pocket, the one Evelyn had mailed to the motel earlier that evening. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk. Then, I faced the keypad. My fingers trembled as I punched in Evelyn's birthday, the 6-digit sequence Margaret thought she had erased from history. With a hiss of hydraulic pressure, the vault door swung open. Inside, the air was stagnant and smelled of old ink. I didn't have much time. I ignored the stacks of gold coins and the velvet boxes of jewelry. I went straight for the leather-bound ledgers at the back. I pulled out the original deed for the Henderson family holdings from 1995. I turned the page to the signature line. There it was. My father-in-law's name, written in a shaky hand that looked nothing like his bold, expansive script found in earlier documents. Below it, witnessed by a notary who had been dead for 10 years, was Margaret's flourish. "Looking for something, Anna?" The voice cracked through the silence like a whip. I spun around, my flashlight beam catching David standing in the doorway of the vault. He looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot and his clothes stained with soot from the fire. He held a heavy glass decanter in one hand, and he was swaying slightly. "David," I whispered, clutching the ledger to my chest. "You need to see this. Your mother forged your father's will. She stole the entire estate from you and Evelyn." David let out a bitter, wet laugh. "I know, Anna. I have known for 5 years. Why do you think she pays my bills? Why do you think she keeps me on such a short leash? It is not love. It is hush money." The realization hit me harder than the cold rain ever could. David wasn't just a victim or a coward. He was a co-conspirator. He had traded his soul and his father's legacy for a downtown office and a title that meant nothing. "She is upstairs calling the police," David said, his voice devoid of emotion. "She saw you on the hidden camera she installed last week. The one I forgot to tell you about. You have about 4 minutes before the deputies arrive. Then move, David," I said, stepping forward. "Move, or I will make sure the police see exactly what you have been hiding in your business accounts too." David looked at the ledger in my hand, then at the door. For a second, I saw a flicker of the man I thought I had married. Then he stepped aside and pointed toward the back service entrance. "Go," he muttered, taking a long drink from the decanter. "But if you get caught, I never saw you." I ran. I didn't look back at the house or the man who had let his mother destroy our lives. I reached the car just as the first blue and red lights appeared at the end of the driveway. I threw the ledger onto the passenger seat and drove, the adrenaline finally turning into a grim, triumphant smile. The fire in the backyard might have destroyed the paper trail, but I had the heart of the empire in my hands. And tomorrow, I was going to hand it to a judge. The blue and red lights danced in my rearview mirror for 3 miles before I finally ducked into the underground parking garage of an old, crumbling brick building downtown. My hands were frozen to the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I had committed a felony to get this ledger, and if I was caught now, Margaret would win by default. She wouldn't even need to kill my mother. She would just let the legal system bury me while she liquidated the estate and vanished to Europe. I didn't call Evelyn. I needed someone with a license and a grudge. I took the service elevator to the 4th floor and pounded on the door of a firm that didn't have a brass plaque or a receptionist. Marcus Thorne opened the door, looking like a man who hadn't slept since 2015. He was the lawyer Margaret had disbarred 10 years ago for asking too many questions about her construction bids. Now, he operated out of a room filled with cardboard boxes and the smell of stale coffee. "Anna Henderson," he said, staring at my torn blazer and the heavy ledger clutched to my chest. "You look like you just crawled out of a grave." "I crawled out of Margaret's vault, Marcus," I said, gasping for air. I slammed the ledger onto his desk. "I found the original 95 deed. It is a forgery." David knew. "He has been taking hush money for 5 years. Marcus flipped to the signature page, his eyes narrowing as he pulled a magnifying glass from his drawer. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the ticking of a cheap plastic clock. After a full minute, he looked up, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "She used a ghostwriter," Marcus whispered. "The pressure on the ink. It matches the signature on the charitable foundation checks from the same month. Margaret didn't just forge this. She was lazy about it." "Can you stop her?" I asked. "She is trying to sell the house and flee. She cut off my mother's medical funding." "I have no time, Marcus." "Stopping her is easy," Marcus said, reaching for his phone. "But we have a problem. You broke into a private residence while under a restraining order. The police are looking for you, Anna. If they arrest you before we file this, Margaret's lawyers will argue that the evidence is fruit of a poisonous tree. They will get it suppressed, and you will go to prison for a decade." Just as he spoke, a heavy knock echoed through the door. "Seattle Police." "Open up." My heart stopped. Margaret hadn't just called the police, she had tracked my phone. I had forgotten to turn off the GPS in my panic. Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed the ledger and shoved it into a floor safe hidden beneath a pile of old rugs. "Listen to me," Marcus hissed, grabbing my shoulders. "You are going to walk out there and surrender. Do not say a word about the ledger. Do not mention David. Tell them you went back for your personal clothes and got scared. I will file the emergency injunction with the state court in 1 hour. If I can get a judge to freeze the Henderson assets before your arraignment, she can't touch you. But my mother, I will handle the hospital. I still have friends in administration," Marcus promised. "Go. Now." I walked to the door and turned the deadbolt. 2 officers moved in immediately, their faces stern. I felt the cold bite of the handcuffs on my wrists, the metal clicking into place with a finality that made my stomach turn. "Anna Henderson, you are under arrest for aggravated stalking and residential burglary," one officer said, reciting my rights like a funeral dirge. As they led me down the hallway, I saw a black sedan parked across the street. Margaret was sitting in the back seat, her window rolled down just enough for me to see her eyes. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked triumphant. She gave me a small, mocking wave with a gloved hand before the tinted glass slid back up. She thought the handcuffs were the end of the story. She didn't realize they were just the distraction I needed to let Marcus Thorne burn her world to the ground. The holding cell in the precinct smelled of industrial bleach and old sweat. I sat on the narrow metal bench, my wrists still aching from the handcuffs. Every time the heavy steel door opened, I expected to see a lawyer. But for 6 hours there was only silence. I knew how this worked. Margaret was using her influence to delay my processing, hoping to keep me off the grid just long enough for her to finish her business at the estate. Around midnight, the door finally opened. It wasn't Marcus Thorne. It was David. He looked like a ghost of the man I had married. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his eyes were hollow, as if the light inside him had finally burned out. He stood on the other side of the bars, gripping the cold steel so hard his knuckles turned white. "My mother is at the airport, Anna," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She has a private jet waiting. She sold the Henderson real estate holdings to an offshore group 2 hours ago. She is leaving for a country with no extradition treaty, and she is taking the trust funds with her." I stood up, walking slowly toward the bars. "And you, David? Are you going with her? Or are you just here to deliver the final insult?" David let out a broken, jagged breath. She told the police you tried to kill her in the vault. She told them you had a knife. She is paying a witness to testify, Anna. If she leaves now, you will never be able to prove the truth. You will spend the next 20 years in a cage for a crime she committed. Then do something, David. I hissed, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. You have known the truth for 5 years. You watched her destroy Evelyn. You watched her throw me into the mud. You are watching her kill my mother by freezing those accounts. Is your comfort worth more than a human life? David looked down at his hands. She has my power of attorney, Anna. I signed everything over to her years ago. I have nothing. I am nothing. You have a voice, I said, reaching through the bars to grab his sleeve. The notary who signed that forged deed 10 years ago, he wasn't dead then. He was your mother's personal driver, wasn't he? The one who disappeared after your father's funeral. You know where he is. You are the only one who can lead the police to him. David flinched as if I had struck him. He looked toward the security camera in the corner of the room, then back at me. For the first time in 7 years, I saw a spark of genuine defiance in his eyes. It was small, but it was there. His name is Arthur. David whispered so quietly I could barely hear him. He lives in a trailer park in rural Oregon under a different name. My mother sends him $5,000 a month to stay quiet. I have the bank routing numbers on my personal laptop. Give them to Marcus Thorne, I commanded. He is waiting at his office. If the police have a living witness to the forgery, they can stop that jet. They can freeze the offshore sale. But you have to move now, David. In 1 hour, she will be over the Atlantic, and we will both be dead to the world. David stepped back, his face pale but determined. He didn't say goodbye. He turned and ran toward the exit, his footsteps echoing through the sterile hallway. I sank back onto the metal bench, my heart racing. I had just bet my entire future on a man who had never stood up for anything in his life. I looked up at the flickering fluorescent light, praying that for once, the sun would find the strength to betray the mother who had turned him into a shadow. Minutes later, a guard walked by and tossed a plastic cup of water onto the floor. Don't get too comfortable, Henderson. Your transfer to the county jail is in 30 minutes. I closed my eyes. The clock was ticking, and the woman who had ruined my life was minutes away from vanishing into the clouds with my mother's future in her carry-on bag. The transfer van was idling outside the precinct, its back doors open like the mouth of a waiting beast. I was being led toward it, my ankles shackled now, the heavy chain clinking against the concrete with every step. The night air was freezing, but I didn't feel the cold. I only felt the crushing weight of the ticking clock. My eyes were fixed on the dark horizon, imagining the roar of a private jet's engines as Margaret escaped into the clouds. Wait! A voice screamed from the precinct steps. I turned my head to see Marcus Thorne sprinting toward the officers, holding a stack of papers and his cell phone. Behind him, looking pale and shaking, was David. But Marcus wasn't looking at me. He was shouting at the sergeant in charge of the transfer. You need to see this now, Marcus yelled, thrusting his phone toward the sergeant's face. That is a recorded confession from Arthur Vance, the notary on the 1995 Henderson deed. And those are bank transfers from Margaret Henderson's private account to his offshore wallet, dated every month for 10 years. The sergeant frowned, pulling back. We have a court order for this transfer, counselor. Move aside. The court order was based on a fraudulent report, Marcus roared. The district attorney is on line 1. He has just issued an emergency stay of all proceedings against Anna Henderson, and more importantly, he has issued a federal warrant for Margaret Henderson for human trafficking, tax evasion, and witness tampering. If you let that woman leave the tarmac, her blood is on your hands. The sergeant took the phone, his face changing as he listened to the voice on the other end. He looked at me, then at the van, then back at Marcus. Unshackle her, he ordered. What? The other officer asked, confused. I said unshackle her. Now. The sergeant barked. And get the airport police on the radio. Tell them to block runway 4 left. We have a flight to intercept. As the metal cuffs fell from my wrists, I didn't wait for an apology. I grabbed Marcus's arm. Is she still there? The engines were warming up 5 minutes ago, Marcus said, his voice raspy. But David gave us the tail number. The FAA has already grounded the flight for a security check. She is trapped on the tarmac. Anna. I looked at David. He was standing by the patrol car, his head down, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He had finally done it. He had chosen the truth over the shadow of his mother. I wanted to feel something for him, pity, perhaps, or even a ghost of the love I once had, but there was nothing left but a cold, empty space. "I'm going to the airport," I said. "Anna, you should go to the hospital," Marcus advised. "Your mother is awake." The hospital reinstated her funding the second I sent them the injunction. "I will go to her in a minute," I replied, my voice hard as flint. "But first, I want to see Margaret's face when she realizes she isn't going anywhere." We reached the private terminal in record time, the sirens of the patrol cars cutting through the midnight silence. Through the glass of the gate, I saw the silver jet sitting motionless under the floodlights. A line of police SUVs had boxed it in, their lights flashing blue and red against the polished fuselage. The stairs of the plane lowered, and a woman in a navy wool coat stepped out. Even from 100 yards away, I could see the stiff set of her shoulders. Margaret didn't struggle as the officers reached her. She stood perfectly still, her chin tilted up, trying to maintain the illusion of an empress even as the plastic zip ties were pulled tight around her wrists. I walked out onto the tarmac, the wind whipping my hair across my face. When Margaret saw me, her mask finally cracked. The poise vanished, replaced by a raw, naked hatred that made her look older, uglier. "You think you won?" she hissed as they led her past me. "I still have more money in my hidden accounts than you will earn in 10 lifetimes. I will be out on bail by morning." "No, Margaret," I said, leaning in so only she could hear me. "The offshore accounts were seized 10 minutes ago. David gave Marcus the encryption keys. You don't have 10 lifetimes. You have 25 to life, and in prison, Margaret, no one cares about your designer coats." She lunged at me, a guttural sound escaping her throat, but the officers dragged her away. I stood on the tarmac and watched her be shoved into the back of a police car. The storm had finally passed. The sun rose over Seattle 2 weeks later, not with the gray chill of a storm but with a bright, piercing clarity. I stood on the balcony of the Henderson estate, holding a warm cup of coffee and watching the movers haul away the heavy, ornate furniture that Margaret had prized so much. Under the final court decree, the entire estate, the house, the trust and the real estate holdings had been reverted to the rightful heirs, Evelyn and myself, as the legal representative of the original family line. Margaret was awaiting trial in a state facility. Her request for bail denied after Marcus Thorne proved she was a flight risk with hidden assets in 3 different countries. Without her money and her influence, she was just another inmate in a denim jumpsuit, a thought that brought a quiet, steady peace to my soul. My mother was sitting in a wheelchair in the garden below, surrounded by the blooming roses she had always loved. She was breathing on her own now, her strength returning a little more each day. The hospital bills had been paid in full, and a private nurse was scheduled to stay with her as long as she needed. I had lost 7 years to the Hendersons, but I had saved the one person who truly mattered. A car pulled up the long gravel driveway. It wasn't a silver Mercedes, it was a modest, rented sedan. David stepped out, looking like a man who had spent the last 14 days waking up from a long, drugged sleep. He walked toward the balcony, stopping 10 feet away. He didn't try to come inside. "The lawyers sent over the final divorce papers," David said, his voice quiet. "I signed them this morning. I didn't contest anything, Anna. You keep the apartment, the settlement, and your share of the estate. I'm not taking a dime." "It is a bit late for nobility, David," I said, not looking away from the garden. "But I suppose it is a start. I'm leaving for Oregon tomorrow," he continued. "I am going to help the authorities with the case against Arthur Vance. And then, I don't know. I think I need to figure out who I am when my mother isn't telling me what to think." I finally turned to look at him. I expected to feel anger, but all I felt was a profound sense of closure. David wasn't a monster like Margaret, but he was the bridge that allowed her to walk all over me. He had been a bystander to his own life, and in doing so he had nearly cost me mine. "Good luck, David," I said. It wasn't an invitation to stay, and it wasn't a forgiveness. It was a release. He nodded, a small sad smile touching his lips. He turned and walked back to his car, and as the sound of the engine faded down the driveway, the last shackle of my old life finally snapped. An hour later, Marcus Thorne arrived. He wasn't wearing his wrinkled suit anymore. He looked sharp, revitalized, his career fully restored by the massive win against the city's most powerful family. He handed me a folder. The board of the academy met last night, Marcus said. They have issued a formal public apology for the misunderstanding. They want you back as the head of the English department, with a significant raise and a seat on the board to oversee the new scholarship foundation. I took the folder and looked at the school's crest. For a moment, I thought about the teacher who had stood in the mud with a broken photograph. She felt like a stranger now. Tell them I accept, I said. But on one condition. The scholarship foundation will be renamed after my mother. And we are going to hire a new firm to do the audits. One that doesn't answer to anyone but the truth. Marcus smiled. I think that can be arranged. I walked down the stairs and across the lawn to where my mother was waiting. I knelt beside her, taking her hand in mine. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and rain-washed earth. We are home, Mom, I whispered. She squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with a pride that no amount of Margaret's money could ever buy. I looked back at the great house, the symbol of a legacy built on lies that had finally collapsed under the weight of the truth. I had started this journey with nothing but a shattered picture and a calculated rage. I was ending it with a future that was entirely, beautifully mine.